So this behind me is Mount Si. I went to Mount Si High School, class of 1984. It's a spectacular mountain. Its sun's just about to go down, and so we thought we'd shoot a little segment here. Today, earlier, we talked with Brian Heathman, the publisher of Made for Success, publishes my books, and I thought I would talk to you about a book that I recommend all the time. I recommended it, I think, 3 times in the last week. I probably recommend it at least once a week, if not 2 or more times every week. One of the best business books ever written, and people often ask me for book recommendations. So I'll tell you the book that I recommend probably more than any other book, and it's a book called Positioning. It was written by Jack Trout and Al Rise about 30 years ago. And I just found out, though, that they came out with a new book called Repositioning. Literally, the last person I recommended it to, they went to buy it, and then she's one of my coaching clients. She texted back and she said, "Did you know there's a repositioning?" I said, "Well, it's about time, because I've been telling people this book is an amazing book, but a lot of the analogies and stories and case studies are out of date, but the principles are great." The book is called Positioning. I think it's subtitled The Battle for the Mind. And whether you're running a speaking business like me, or you're an author and you're making a new book, or you own a restaurant, or whatever business you might be in, life insurance business, doesn't really matter. The idea of making a lot of money and building your business has to do with your positioning in the marketplace, and specifically being number one in a category, right? So here's the idea. Everybody always remembers whoever it is that's number one in the category. And in the initial book, he talks about, if you were to ask people who's the number one car company, rental car company in the world, most people would say Hertz, right? And this again was 30 years ago. They own that rental car category. So how do you get traction then in the rental car category? Well, you create another category. And the category would be discount rental cars. So if somebody says, what's the best discount rental car company? No one is going to say Hertz. You create another category to dominate the market, right? So he uses an interesting analogy, at least in the first book. He says, who was the first person to cross the Atlantic, fly solo across the Atlantic? Everybody says Charles Lindbergh. He says, who was the second? And then they say, I don't remember. So then the question he asks is, who was the third? Well, if I don't remember the second, how am I going to remember the third? Well, what if I told you that the third was the first woman? Oh, Amelia Earhart. Okay, who was the second woman? I don't know. So it's about creating a category by niching it down a little bit more. I'll tell you how this happened in my career. When I first started out, I called myself motivational speaker. I hired a speaking coach, a coach to help me with the speaking business, not professional speaking, the actual act of speaking. And it was interesting because he said, you can't be a motivational speaker. And I said, why? And he said, there's just way too many of them. Okay? And so he actually had me walk to my bookcase. So I walk over to my bookcase, and he says, stand in front of your bookcase and tell me, what are most of the books about on your bookcase? And I said, leadership. And he goes, all right, you're really interested in leadership. Have you ever been a leader? I said, yeah, I've always been a leader. Been captain of sports teams, president of my class, in college, a number of different things, right? I've always been a leader, an initiator. And so I niched to leadership. So that created another smaller category, right? Well, from there, I niched even further to influence, and there's very few people that are talking specifically about influence in the speaking world. And what's interesting is you think, well, I want to have a big category because then I'll be able to get a lot of people to hire me, but it actually works in reverse, right? So the bigger the category, the more people you have competing against you. Well, then you make it a smaller one, leadership, and now there's only few people to choose from, and you can raise your rates as a speaker. And then influence, and now actually with my book, The Art of Influence, it's more about the people side, the character side, as opposed to the skill side. So I've niched down even further, talking about character-based influence and persuasion. So that's the way it works. I could use another illustration. If somebody said, who's the greatest public speaker in the world today, or who's got the biggest speaking business in the world today, almost everybody would say Tony Robbins. Now, what if I said, who's the greatest African American speaker in the world today? Well, now Tony's no longer in the category, right? So now you go to this one, and I think almost everybody would say Les Brown, because he's the legend in the industry. He's got to be one of the top 5 speakers of all time, certainly the most successful, most popular, and I think the greatest African-American speaker in the speaking world today. And so do you see what happens when you create that niche? You're able to dominate a particular market. If somebody says, let's go to a restaurant, okay, what restaurant? Well, let's go to Italian. Now all of a sudden you're not competing against the French and the Mexican and the Chinese and the American continental. Now you're just narrowed down to Mexican. Well, what happens if you become the margarita place within the Mexican, right? Or you're known for making your own tortillas fresh, right? You're the fresh tortilla Mexican place. So my challenge to you, and I hope you get the principle here, my challenge to you is in whatever industry you're in, how can you create a category in which you are the sole answer for it? Whether it's a speaking business or it's a restaurant or it's whatever it is, how can you create a category by which you are the sole answer to it, where somebody's saying, well, I'm thinking about buying this or going here. The only place to go or the only thing to buy is you. It's about positioning. Sometimes you have to create your own market. I'll tell you one last thing. When I was just cresting into the big time as a speaker, I was working with Jim Rohn and Zig Ziglar, and I'd just come off of working with John Maxwell. And Jim Rohn gave me an endorsement, and it had to do with positioning myself. And the endorsement worked out perfectly for me. And Jim was so amazing to give me that endorsement. If somebody would have said, hey, let's hire the best speaker in the world or the best legendary speaker in the world, they would have never thought of me. They just never would have thought of me. It wouldn't have been like, hey, let's get Chris Widener. They'd say, back in the day, let's get Zig or Anthony Robbins or Jim Rohn or one of those guys, Les Brown or one of those guys. But what Jim's endorsement did was sort of pass the mantle to me, where he said, Chris is the leader of a new generation of personal development experts. And so, do you see what happened there? In the broader category, I was never going to compete as a legend against the true legends, right, who've been at it for 30, 40, 50 years. But we created a new category, the next generation of speakers. And when Jim said Chris is the leader of a new generation, all of a sudden you have a new category, right? And so I want you to think about how you can create that category in which you are positioned as the #1 dominant force.